6. Lockheed C-130 Hercules. On November 16, 2017, one of the newest additions to the marine park in Aqaba, Jordan, was sunk, and divers have taken a liking to it. It was scuttled after a large ceremony sponsored by ASEZA, or the Aqaba Special Economic Zone Authority, and was captured by the members of the international media. The Hercules plane sank 984 feet from the beach and 55 feet underwater. All potentially dangerous materials, like fuel, oil, and paint, were removed. The basic structure transformed into an artificial reef and attracted fish and corals. It created a unique new habitat for a variety of species found in Aqaba. The Royal Jordanian Air Force donated the 4-engine turboprop military transport aircraft called the Lockheed C-130 Hercules. Since the 1950s, the plane has been the primary tactical airlifter for armed forces in over 70 countries worldwide. As Aqaba's main dive site, it will eventually draw divers from all kinds of backgrounds. The Hercules is a beautiful sight, measuring 98 feet in length and 131 feet in wingspan. The location is only susceptible to slight currents, and the high visibility in the Red Sea makes it easier to dive in the wreck. This makes it almost always visible from the surface. The Hercules is unquestionably a very massive aircraft. Despite its modest nose cone and cockpit, the plane's fuselage is taller than it is wide, and even though the aircraft's engines and propellers were taken out to ensure safe sinking, the vast wingspan and empty engine cowlings provide an impressive idea of the force the aircraft had in operation. Although it was never the plan, the C-130 Hercules wreck in Aqaba has deliberately been made accessible. Divers of all skill levels and ages may take part in this family-friendly tour as they take a look into the historic wreck. 5. Underwater drones. 3 drones used to smuggle drugs underwater across the sea from Morocco have been seized by Spanish police. The submersibles were unmanned and were able to carry over 441 pounds of cargo. 8 people were arrested after a 14-month investigation in Barcelona, Malaga, and Cadiz. According to police, they have dismantled a group that they believe built the cars and gave them to drug smugglers operating across Europe. Spanish authorities say this is the first time they've found an underwater vehicle that can be driven without a human operating it. These gadgets could enable drug traffickers to remotely transport significant amounts of drugs over the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow body of water dividing Spain from Morocco. 2 other submarines were being manufactured, while one had already been completed. The pair that was being built are thought to have been given to a French gang for importing cocaine. Drug traffickers could theoretically control the vehicles from anywhere in the world with an internet-enabled device as basic as a tablet, since they're equipped with GPS navigation systems. A father and son were among those detained. According to police, the father was a licensed helicopter pilot. They claim he had the technical knowledge required to construct and operate such advanced vehicles. The gang was suspected of delivering the devices to criminal organizations in Denmark, Italy, France, and Spain. According to officials, they were experts in engineering a variety of air, land, and sea vehicles intended to carry narcotics. Investigators have previously discovered vehicles meant for narcotics transportation beneath the water. Earlier this year, a semi-submersible ship was traveling to Central America. They were stopped, though, because they were carrying 4 kilos of cocaine. 4. Sunken Florida vehicles. In the canals and lakes of southern Florida, eerie submerged vehicles wait, sometimes for decades, hiding the remains of lives that were lost. These wrecks are uncommon, but data suggests that they seem to happen more often on dry rural roads. 168 people died in collisions involving water between 2011 and 2016, according to statistics from the Florida Department of Transportation. Around 25% of the incidents involved people who were drunk or driving recklessly. Out of the deaths in the waterways, 29 happened in Palm Beach County, 25 in Broward County, and 8 in Miami-Dade County. After Surya Sari Prihatin disappeared in 2010, her husband Munawar Toha appeared on TV, begging her to come home for him and their 2 children. Coincidentally, at the same time, police were pulling the couple's car from the lake next to Toha's job. Surya's body was found dead inside. Her husband is now serving a life sentence for the murder of his wife. During the trial, video evidence showed him pushing the vehicle he and his wife shared into the lake. In September 2017, just days before Hurricane Irma hit, the Boca Rio Canal revealed a Toyota RAV4 SUV. Lorraine Pino, 47, was found inside it. She used to live by the canal. On that same day, 5 other vehicles were uncovered. Pino was a loving grandma who served the underprivileged community and donated money to good causes. She had disappeared on December 19, 2016. Her DNA was verified by the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office. The Broward Sheriff's Dive Rescue Team pulled 23 vehicles out of lakes and canals in 2017 and 19 vehicles in 2018. Most of them were empty with no human remains. The Davie Police Department estimates that each year they remove about 15 vehicles from Southwest ranches and the town's waterways, where they also carry out patrols. In 2017, Boca Raton police divers recovered 5 vehicles, and 2 were recovered in 2018. Not every wreck is the result of a collision. Some were stolen, others happened because of simple mistakes. According to Brett Holcomb of Westway Towing, when drivers are inexperienced, their trucks follow their boats into the water, resulting in frequent calls for help coming from the boat ramps. His company pulls about 15 to 20 cars from the water. The sheriff deputy says that 50 cars or less are sitting in the waters of Broward County. That number is constantly changing because they're being dumped in the water almost every day. And there are possibly many more undetected vehicles in places where sonar searches are impossible. Why do you think so many cars were sunk in Florida? Let us know in the comments. 3. World War II-era amphibious truck. An Italian organization claims that a U.S. military amphibious truck from World War II has been found near Lake Garda in Italy. On April 29, 1945, troops from the 10th Mountain Division of the United States Army crossed Italy's biggest lake while trying to seize Benito Mussolini's mansion, which was in charge of the Italian Social Republic from Lake Garda's western bank. Until the final week of the war, the division fought the Germans in northern Italy. 4 DUKW designated amphibious vehicles, sometimes called ducks by GIs, were traveling from Torbol to the northern end of Lake Garda when a storm suddenly developed. One of the trucks was flooded with water. The lone survivor was a soldier who had once worked as a lifeguard in the civilian world. The other 23 soldiers were labeled MIA. The 4 cars were part of an advanced force for Allied soldiers traveling to Riva del Garda, which was controlled by the Germans. The teams drove farther into the lake than they normally needed to because they feared snipers. They were unaware that the Germans had already fled the site. On December 10, 2012, the Voluntary Association of Lake Garda published video footage taken underwater of the rusting vehicle that had been found using sonar senses and a tiny unmanned underwater vessel meant for deep-sea research. These amphibious vehicles, or ducks, can float in the water or drive on land. To carry supplies and troops during World War II, over 20,000 were created. To help the Allies in winning the war, they were also utilized in beach assaults. The rusting duck was found 600 feet below the lake's surface. There was hope that the missing servicemen's remains would finally be found and taken back to the United States, but despite a thorough search, no tangible remnants of the soldiers were found. 2. Sunken World War II barge. The Po, Italy's biggest river, is currently so low that a sunken World War II ship is protruding out from the water. The barge, known as the Zibello, delivered supplies during the war before sinking to the bottom of the river close to the town of Gualtieri in 1943. In the past, the Po's water levels were at a point where the ship's bow could be seen. Now that northern Italy is experiencing a record-breaking drought, more of the 164-foot-long yacht can be seen. The river has not seen a drought like this in over 70 years. It's reported that temperatures in northern Italy are 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above average, and that there hasn't been any rain in over 110 days. Additionally, the area received 70% less snowfall than usual throughout the winter. These and other variables have resulted in the Po's water levels and flow rates being well below average for June 2022. In certain places, there's so little water that it's possible to cross the river on foot. The water travels 405 miles from the mountainous Alps to the Adriatic Sea. For farmers and ranchers who grow tomatoes or make Parmesan cheese, the river provides the necessary water. The region, also known as the Valley of Italian Food, accounts for roughly 40% of Italian cuisine. Farmers already anticipate smaller harvests this year due to the lack of water for irrigation. The many hydroelectric power facilities that depend on water from the Po to generate electricity could also be in danger because of the drought. The Po and its tributaries provide about 55% of the hydroelectric energy used in Italy. The drought is also revealing more historical artifacts that the water has long kept concealed, in addition to the Zibello barge. In March 2022, a long-lost tank that German forces drove into the ocean in 1945 was found in Surmide by a volunteer who noticed metal poking out of the sand. The Guardian reported that in Piedmont, the remains of an old village have also re-emerged. Drought in other parts of the world has uncovered a town in Spain and a 3,400-year-old town in Iraq. With water levels decreasing everywhere, who knows what else will pop up? 1. Lake Como's hidden world. One of the most beautiful lakes in the world is found an hour north of Milan, nestled between the Italian and Swiss Alps. The well-known Lake Como is thought to be the deepest lake in Italy, reaching 1,394 feet deep. In addition to the gorgeous mansions, celebrities, and breathtaking vistas, Lake Como offers much more. One of the most astonishing collections of historically preserved objects in the world can be found by diving into the deep, icy waters. There are several wrecks scattered across the lake, including steamships, boats, motorbikes, World War II tanks, armaments, unexploded bombs, seaplanes, and a fairly big vehicle graveyard. The extensive collection of sunken boats, gondolas, and even a steamer is the source of awe for many divers. A Mini, Renault 4, Volkswagen Passat, Fiat 500, Jaguar, Piaggio, Fanticissimo, and Land Cruiser are among some of the automobiles in the museum. There's also a rumor of a church in Leno that flooded in the year 1400, close to the Golfo di Venere. A holy water shrine was recovered from the depths in 2006, with a tiled floor and steps. A little site named Moregolo in the Lecco region is a particularly deep diving spot, with a 164-foot vertical drop that has been used to sink many cars. The first vehicles rest at a depth of roughly 131 to 157 feet due to the drop. So in order to visit one, you have to be a trained diver. In the past, the lake was used to hide artifacts, which had an adverse environmental impact in some areas. Due to the wide appeal, Moregolo, according to cave expert and speleologist Luigi Cassetti, is the greatest place to dive in Lake Como. Many divers come every week from all corners to investigate the area's chilly waters, where 50 cars have been identified so far, particularly at depths of less than 131 feet. Other vehicles, like a BMW 525 and a Fiat 124 Coupe Alpha Sprint Veloce, have also been found on the lake's opposite coast, close to Dervio and Melgon. A World War II-era military hardware and weaponry museum at Olsio, which is close to Moregolo, is there as well. An Italian battle tank is almost entirely covered in the muck of the lake bed, along with bullets, bombs, and cannons. In addition to the sunken vehicles and motorbikes in this lake, high-depth divers will find incredible stone walls that descend to the bottom of the lake. There have been several different items found near the Moregolo sunken cars, including a yacht, speedboats, an ape crucifix, and many more. 3. The Flying Tigers. In China, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces put aside their differences in order to team up against the Japanese. From the beginning, China was at an extreme disadvantage because its country lacked air support, leaving them seemingly defenseless to Japanese bombings. However, U.S. Army aviator Claire Lee Chennault decided to lend his expertise, as he'd been in China since the mid-1930s. He was known for being opinionated, controversial, and extremely daring. He challenged his superiors on more than one occasion, which resulted in his forced early retirement. But he also suffered from health issues, and he was ultimately medically discharged from the Army Air Corps in 1937 at the age of 43. The very next day, Chennault was recruited by the Chinese Air Force, who was eager to have him lead the Chinese fighter pilots in training. Tensions between China and Japan were growing, and by the summer of 1941, they were at war with each other. As a result, Chennault immediately rose to the position of commander and advisor of the Chinese Air Force, and would later go on to lead his own wing, known as the American Volunteer Group, AVG. In 1937, the Sino-Soviet Treaty, a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and China, was signed. The Soviets helped to supply fighter aircraft and bombers to their newly found allies, which were utilized by Chennault for 2 years in order to ward off Japanese attacks. However, by 1940, the Chinese defense had been overwhelmed by the Japanese, resulting in the destruction of the majority of their air force. This also ended most of the support they were receiving from the Soviet Union. As a result, the Chinese were desperate for planes and eventually turned to the US for assistance. At the time, the US was not involved in the war, but President Roosevelt couldn't stand the idea of Japan defeating China before turning its attention to his country. Chennault then made the trip to the US to see what he could in order to acquire planes. He met with a Chinese official, T.V. Soong, in Washington, D.C., to try to get as many supplies as he could. After negotiations were made, the Chinese Air Force purchased 100 American-made Curtiss P-40 fighter planes, also known as Warhawks. These aircraft were single-engine, single-seat, ground attack planes made entirely of metal, and they were used heavily throughout the war by the Allied powers. With 13,738 total Warhawks manufactured, it was ranked the third most produced American-made fighter throughout World War II. The plane's iconic shark's mouth paint scheme wasn't added to the aircraft until later. The idea came about when a group of AVG pilots who were visiting friends noticed a picture of an airplane painted in the color scheme on the front cover of the Illustrated Weekly of India. This gave them the inspiration for the ferocious shark face. When Chennault was informed of this plan, he declared that all of their planes would be painted that way since he loved it so much. On paper, the American Volunteer Group's AVG planes didn't compare to Japan's aircraft. However, the pilots of the AVG later learned to successfully exploit weaknesses in Japanese air forces while highlighting the strengths of their own. In order to better their chances, Chennault dispatched recruiters to American military bases. President Roosevelt allowed some men to go, but at the time it was against the law for any American military personnel to get involved in the conflict there. So President Roosevelt granted them permission to go, but all of the men that were recruited had to resign from their military positions beforehand. The AVG's recruitment process began in the summer of 1941 and extended into the fall. The crew consisted of 59 pilots from the Navy, 33 from the Army, and 7 from the Marines. On top of that, they also had a support crew of about 200 people. This would officially begin the American Volunteer Group, later known as the Flying Tigers. Less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on December 20th, 1941, they conducted their first combat mission and intercepted 10 Japanese bombers west of Kunming, China. One of the first aviation victories in the Pacific was achieved here. During a terribly dark time for everyone involved, this and many more daring deeds offered hope to the home front and the Allies. The Japanese bombers were caught off guard when Chennault's well-prepared squadron attacked them. The group was taught to use a diving attack by their fearless leader. Dive, shoot, then dive away, which worked effectively. This tactic increased the speed of their P-40s while reducing the risk of a counterattack. The Japanese had lost 9 bombers by the end of the battle, leaving only 1 for them to return with. Soon after, the Tigers would find themselves in combat near Rangoon, Burma. This time, the Tigers were assisting the British Air Force against Japanese attacks in defense of Rangoon, which played a key role in China's war efforts. The supply lines from China's coast were sealed off by Japan, which led China to depend on the port of Rangoon all the way to Burma Road in Kunming. In January and February of 1942, battles ensued in Japanese-controlled Thailand and Burma. The Tigers have since been given credit for taking down 299 Japanese airplanes, confirmed and unconfirmed. They also hold the record to this day of only losing 12 of their own men in combat. Despite being outnumbered, usually 4-1, the Tigers were able to put up a fierce fight against the oncoming Japanese, causing massive damage and hindering the enemy's attack. The Japanese Imperial Army would have stormed into Burma and likely would have established a foundation in China, if not for the resistance of the Flying Tigers and the British Royal Air Force. Out of the 50 air battles they were involved in, the Flying Tigers never lost one. Today, there are several monuments, memorials, and museum displays devoted to the Flying Tigers in China, the US, Taiwan, and Thailand. Frank Losonsky, the final surviving member of the original AVG, passed away in February 2020. What's the worst thing you've ever experienced while on a plane? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. The Lost Squadron. In the summer of 1942, a large-scale American invasion of the Pacific began. It set the stage for a lengthy campaign of island hopping and guerrilla warfare. After the U.S. defeated the Japanese at Midway and Guadalcanal, military troops across the world prepared for the Allied invasion of Europe. They increased the number of American troops and planes that were sent overseas in a mission known as Operation Bolero. 2 B-17 bombers and 6 P-38 fighters left Greenland at 3 a.m. on July 15, 1942, not knowing they would soon become involved in one of Bolero's most infamous missions. Before flying to Great Britain, the pilots intended to refuel in Iceland. However, when they were about 90 minutes from Reykjavik, they encountered a stretch of dense cloud cover which forced them to turn around and head back to Greenland. Unfortunately, they had to get ready for an emergency landing on the ice caps below, since they were already running low on fuel. The first aircraft to touch down, a P-38 piloted by Brad McManus, rolled onto its back, but the pilot was uninjured. The rest of the aircraft was right behind, which left the squad trapped on a desolate glacier near Køge Bay in southeastern Greenland. Luckily, everyone was still alive. A Special Air Force unit arrived at the accident site 9 days after the original landing and accompanied the 25-member crew on a 10-mile or 16-kilometer journey to the coast. When they finally arrived at their destination, they were picked up by a Coast Guard cutter. Sadly, the crew's airplanes were left behind, buried under the ice at a depth of 250 to 300 feet or 76 to 107 meters, seemingly forced to spend an eternity trapped on the glaciers of Greenland. The operation was dubbed the Lost Squadron, which proved to be a suitable name, at least until 1992. During this year, one of the P-38's, Glacier Girl, was saved and given a second chance at flight. Robert Wilson's aircraft, Echo, another P-38, was also located. This left only 6 of the original squadrons still trapped underneath the ice caps of Greenland. In 2011, while performing radar scans in the area, researchers from the organization Arctic Hotpoint Solutions discovered Echo. They came back in early 2018 with drones outfitted with ground-penetrating radar. After locating the plane's final resting place, the team confirmed its identification by melting through several layers of thick ice using a heat probe driven by a high-pressure washer system. According to Tom Metcalf, who reports for Live Science, the probe came back coated in hydraulic fluid, a definite indicator that it made contact with the submerged aircraft. Atlanta businessmen Pat Epps and Richard Taylor were largely responsible for the first Lost Squadron ship being found, Glacier Girl. They co-founded the Greenland Expedition Society in 1981. And Epps, Taylor, and Kentucky businessman Roy Schaffner spent over 10 years devising a recovery plan. In order to salvage the planes, they would have to somehow release the aircraft from 300 feet or 91 meters of solid ice. A 17-foot-long, 5-meter, 3-ton chunk of metal from Glacier Girl's center was finally liberated on August 1, 1992, concluding the 11-year struggle for the team. The fighter made a victorious comeback in October of 2002, 60 long years after the initial incident took place. The plane was showcased in a number of special occasions and air performances around the country following its return to service. With the help of advanced technology, Echo will soon be able to join Glacier Girl in the skies once again. Its location has already been discovered, and the rescue team is currently working on recovering it from the ice. 1. Ghost Bomber. On the 23rd of November 1944, an anti-aircraft unit stationed outside of Kortenberg, Belgium, working for the Royal Air Force, noticed a B-17 Flying Fortress heading in their direction. The enormous U.S. bomber from the Army Air Forces approached quickly with its landing gears already down. The ground crew assumed it was an emergency landing because there was no scheduled landing set to take place, so they responded accordingly. With the pilot of the Flying Fortress unable to land effectively, it plowed into a field nearby. The aircraft's landing was so quick and erratic that the propellers broke off and both wings slammed into the ground during the fall, after narrowly avoiding a collision with the unit's weapons. Soldiers on the ground waited for over 15 minutes for the bomber's crew to appear from the wreckage, but no one emerged. After another 5 minutes passed without any sign of life, Major John V. Crisp approached the B-17 cautiously. It took him a while to locate an entrance hatch due to his lack of familiarity with the aircraft. However, the Major eventually found the hatch under the fuselage, opened it, and entered the bomber by himself. Upon searching, 12 neatly wrapped parachutes were found, making this occurrence even more strange. Surprisingly, the crew of the crashed B-17 was nowhere in sight. The only clue Major Crisp discovered was from the code book he found in the wreckage, with the last note reading, "Bad flak." In most cases, flak refers to explosive shells from an anti-aircraft weapon. But in spite of this statement, the bomber merely experienced landing-related damage. For a while, it was unclear what may have happened to the B-17, which later earned the nickname Phantom Fortress. The 91st Bombardment Group's involvement with the aircraft itself was verified. The Phantom's last known mission was supposedly bombing oil refineries in Merseburg, Germany. But apparently something went horribly wrong. Amazingly, the Phantom's crew was located in Belgium, alive and well. They claimed that the plane's bomb rack became problematic. As they turned away from their group to fix the issue, they were hit by enemy fire, further damaging the rack and destroying one of the engines. When it became evident that the bomber wouldn't make it, the crew opted to turn around and aim for Belgium instead of England. To keep the B-17 in the air, they discarded extra weight along the route. The Phantom's crew decided to get out after things continued to deteriorate. They said they put the aircraft on autopilot before bailing out of the plane. However, the bomber didn't appear to have any of the damage the crew said it did, contradicting their account of events. Attempts to uncover the real story continued, and although it seems odd, the Phantom's crew may have been telling the truth. After the crew bailed from the aircraft, the engines may have restarted on their own. Due to their ignorance and limited knowledge of flak damage from the departing end, the original investigators might have confused fighting damage with crash damage. The ideas are probable, but none explained why the crew's parachutes remained on board. Investigators have also been unable to determine how the bomber was able to land in what appeared to be one piece, which is the most challenging aspect of flying. The unmanned crash landing of the Phantom was a first, and many people were curious as to how it occurred. The most effective idea ultimately came down to chance. The bomber accidentally made a crash landing in a way that only a legendary bomber pilot could potentially achieve by dropping altitude at the correct speed and angle for a fall. The Phantom's autonomous landing is still one of the many odd and mystifying occurrences that have been known to happen during combat, and none of them have been fully explained to this day.
Number 8. Contaminated water at Camp Lejeune. From 1953 to 1987, and possibly longer, the tap water at the Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, was heavily contaminated with dangerous toxins. Soldiers and families living on the base drank and bathed in the poisonous water, which contained concentrations of hazardous chemicals ranging from 240 to 3,400 times the permitted safety levels. The first concrete evidence of the contamination came during the 1980s, when the water was tested for certain chemicals for the first time under newly imposed environmental regulations. Initial reports claimed that the tainted water could not be linked to any serious long-term health problems, despite the water containing degreaser, benzene, vinyl chloride, and dry cleaning solvent, among other toxins. Even after word of the contamination started to get out and the high cancer and birth defect rates among former Camp Lejeune residents became evident, the U.S. government remained in denial about the toxic water's effects on human health. Victims alleged that the deception started with Marine Corps leaders who had early knowledge of the contamination and failed to take action to resolve the issue or inform people of their compromised health. The improper disposal of hazardous waste that once occurred regularly at the base is thought to be a major cause of the contamination. Over the years, an estimated 800,000 gallons of benzene leaked into the ground and toxified the drinking water. The Marine Corps was aware of this, yet conveniently omitted it from a health report that it submitted for federal review in 1992. Authorities finally publicly acknowledged the severity of the problem in 2009. In 2012, former President Barack Obama signed the Janie Ensminger Act into law to provide medical care for those affected by the long-ignored problem. To date, over 800 former residents of Camp Lejeune have filed claims against the military, totaling nearly $4 billion. The true extent of the damage will never be known, since people who once lived at the base are spread out all over the world, but up to 1 million people are thought to have been poisoned. The Environmental Protection Agency placed Camp Lejeune and 236 miles of North Carolina's coastal land on its list of Superfund sites in 1989, and its cleanup remains a major priority today. Number 7. Unexploded Tallboy Bomb. In 2019, workers discovered a 6-ton bomb during a project to deepen Poland's Piast Channel. Known as a Tallboy, the 19-foot-long explosive was designed by the British during the Second World War. It was the largest unexploded World War II bombs ever found in Poland, and it was inconveniently located in one of the country's busiest shipping waterways. Tallboys were among the largest explosives used during the conflict. They were so powerful, their effects mimicked an earthquake. The bomb that was found in the Piast Channel was dropped on April 6, 1945, during a raid on the German cruiser Lützow. Authorities were initially unsure of what to do with the 12,000-pound weapon, which had sat undisturbed at the bottom of the channel for 75 years. It was almost completely buried in the sediment 40 feet from the water's surface and seemed like a non-threat to shipping traffic. But any unexploded munition is a hazard, especially in a busy place. The channel remained open while a crisis team planned for the delicate process of removing the gigantic bomb. In 2020, more than a year after its discovery, a team of divers attempted to defuse the explosive. Knowing there was a 50-50 chance that it would detonate, authorities evacuated 750 people from the immediate area ahead of time. Using a remote-controlled device, the team tried to burn the bomb's explosive charge without detonating it, a process known as deflagration. Despite their best efforts, it blew up, causing a huge column of water to blast into the air. Luckily, the divers were far enough away to avoid injury. Number 6. Agent Orange. During the Vietnam War, American forces dumped tens of millions of gallons of toxic herbicides across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in a deadly decade-long campaign codenamed Operation Ranch Hand. The clandestine mission's purpose was to deprive the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese military of food and vegetation cover by using the chemicals to destroy crops and vegetation. The most heavily used herbicide was famously known as Agent Orange. It caused serious health issues among the civilians and military members who were exposed to it. While symptoms often started with a rash, the effects were far more lasting and include cancer, severe neurological issues, liver problems, birth defects, Parkinson's disease, nerve disorders, immune system dysfunction, and heart problems, just to name a few. Many people still suffer today, and evidence suggests that the landscape remains heavily polluted, especially when it comes to the high rate of birth defects in the affected regions. For decades, the Vietnamese and American governments have gone back and forth trying to reach a reasonable agreement regarding the American government's financial obligations towards the massive cleanup efforts that are needed, along with the cost of medical care for those affected by Agent Orange in Southeast Asia. The U.S. government finally started assisting in post-war cleanup efforts in 2012. Have you ever heard of Agent Orange before? Tell us in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 5. Nuclear pollution at Bikini Atoll. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. military detonated 23 nuclear bombs at Bikini Atoll, a coral island located within the Marshall Islands in the central Pacific Ocean. The American government relocated native residents to nearby Rongerik Atoll and Kili Island and promised everyone that they'd be allowed to return after the testing was finished. While the military was busy experimenting with weapons of mass destruction with little care or concern for the environmental effects, the islands that the relocated residents were now forced to call home proved to be unfit to sustain life. Starvation ensued, leaving the population vulnerable and in an ongoing need of aid. In the meantime, the nuclear tests heavily polluted the soil and water at Bikini Atoll, rendering it uninhabitable. During the early years of testing, nearby Rongelap Atoll was engulfed in fallout, and even more people were relocated. In the early 1970s, 12 years after the last nuclear test at Bikini Atoll, the U.S. government erroneously deemed it fit for habitation and told its former residents that it was safe to return. But the environment there remained contaminated, and the population was forced out again in 1978 when it was discovered that the food they were growing and eating contained high levels of radiation. Rongelap's residents, who had been allowed to return at the tail end of the nuclear testing, fled in 1985 amid fears of lingering radiation. After years of being called out for its negligent response to the damage, the U.S. government reluctantly compensated the islanders and their descendants for their displacement and the nuclear damage, as well as land damage and personal injury claims. The fund ran out in 2012, and the U.S. has since declined to provide further assistance, despite the UN's urging to provide more help. Bikini Atoll remains contaminated, and its future is uncertain as scientists, activists, and Bikinian authorities with limited resources try to determine if a future cleanup effort is feasible. Number 4. Runit Island. While the population left behind the U.S. military's nuclear bomb tests at Bikini Atoll is widely known, it's not the only part of the Marshall Islands that was subjected to the ill effects of dangerous weapons experiments. During the same years that the testing was going on at Bikini Atoll, similar activities were going on at Runit Island, one of the 40 coral islands that make up Eniwetok Atoll. During the 1970s, workers built a concrete dome for housing nuclear waste left behind from the tests. Nicknamed the Tomb, it was meant to be a temporary fix while the American government devised a long-term decontamination plan. But that never happened, and today the structure is crumbling, allowing radioactive waste to seep into the soil. A major weather event like a typhoon or a storm surge is all it would take to rip the dome out of the ground and disperse its contents into the ocean. And a scenario like this seems increasingly likely as climate change intensifies. Even in the absence of a catastrophic incident, damage is still being done as the contamination continues to leak, causing locals to fear for their health. The U.S. returned Eniwetok Atoll to the Marshallese government during the 1980s. Runit Island was quarantined decades ago and remains off limits today, but this doesn't necessarily protect residents from the harmful effects of the waste, which can easily spread throughout the environment. While the American government claims that it's fulfilled its cleanup obligations to the country, Marshallese authorities argue that they lack the resources to clean up the lingering mess that the U.S. left behind and has a moral obligation to assist with. Number 3. Leftover bombs in Laos. Over 2.2 million tons of explosives were dropped on Laos during air raids between 1964 and 1973. Making it the world's most heavily bombed country. The U.S. military carried out these attacks during the Vietnam War as part of a secret plot masterminded by the CIA to disrupt movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and prevent supplies from reaching the North Vietnamese. Even to this day, few Americans know about the 9-year campaign, informally nicknamed the Secret War, which was carried out with little regard for civilian safety. Leftover bombs have killed more than 20,000 people since the war ended in 1975, and they continue to maim and kill to this day. There are an estimated 80 million bombs littering the land, posing a constant risk to the people who live surrounded by them. Progress is slowly being made as various nonprofits work diligently to remove the unexploded ordnance. On the 25th anniversary of its ongoing cleanup effort in 2019, the UK-based Mines Advisory Group announced the disposal of its 250,000th bomb. Just 2 days later, in late 2021, the group removed its 300,000th bomb from the ground, marking yet another milestone in its quest to help make Laos safe again. But there's a lot of work left to do before civilians can traverse the landscape without risking their lives, and many have accused the US government of shirking its duty to clean up its own mess. In 2016, former President Barack Obama vowed to step up America's efforts and pledged $90 million towards removing bombs from Laos. The US made good on its promise, but unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to do, and progress remains slow as groups involved with carrying out the cleanup continue to experience budget shortfalls. Number 2. The Hanford Site. In 1943, the U.S. government established a nuclear production complex along the Columbia River in Benton County, Washington, known as the Hanford Site. It was developed as part of the infamous Manhattan Project and was home to the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. The world's first nuclear bomb and the Fat Man atomic bomb that the U.S. dropped on Nagasaki during World War II contained plutonium that was produced at the Hanford Site. During the Cold War, the secretive facility was expanded. It eventually grew to include 9 nuclear reactors and 5 plutonium processing complexes, where the plutonium for most of the U.S. nuclear arsenal's more than 60,000 weapons was made. Most of the nuclear reactors were shut down between 1964 and 1971, and the final reactor was finally decommissioned in 1987. Over 53 million gallons of highly radioactive waste was left behind. By the time authorities devised a cleanup plan in 1989, there were significant amounts of radioactivity. In recent years, it was discovered that an underground tank at the site had been leaking hundreds of gallons of radioactive waste into the ground every year since 2010. The pollution remains a problem today as the scientists work to assess the radiation's effects on the environment, wildlife, and human health. And while it may be too late to undo a lot of the damage, the information will help experts determine how to prevent it from worsening. Number 1. Thule airbase crash. On January 21, 1968, an American B-52 bomber carrying 4 nuclear bombs crashed in a fjord 700 miles north of the Arctic Circle near Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland. A crew member had stuffed seat cushions near a heating vent, causing a fire to break out. The smoke became unbearably thick, forcing the crew to eject. By carrying the powerful hydrogen bombs through Greenland's airspace, the U.S. was in violation of Denmark's nuclear-free zone policy, which had been in effect since 1957. The Danish government was less than pleased with the incident, especially since the warheads had broken open during the crash and were leaking radioactive contamination into the water. Denmark demanded that the debris and anything around it that had been contaminated be gathered and relocated to American territory. A cleanup effort codenamed Project Crested Ice ensued and was ultimately deemed a success, despite 1 nuclear warhead having never been found. In addition to covering the costs of the cleanup, the American government compensated those who assisted in the effort and were later diagnosed with cancer. Thanks for watching. Which of these secret military cleanups shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.